So last week, Tucker and I went down to New Haven to check it out. We went to the 3 places that everybody said we couldn't miss. We tried pizza from each, and I've been working away trying to figure out how it is that we can do that in a home oven, or at least honor it in some way with elements of that style. Come on, Tucker, let's eat. Dude, you gotta go in there. It's amazing. It's like being in a bakery. The heat from the oven is just incredible. The doughs are super thin. It's amazing. Let's go try a slice. We ordered this ahead so we could just walk in and pick it up. The place is already jam-packed, like tons of people in there already eating, which is kind of funny. I mean, what time is it? I guess it's 11:30. So the dough is super crackery, very thin, nice robust bake. You can see the heat just cranking out of the oven. I mean, obviously that's pretty dark, but the bite doesn't taste bitter. It doesn't taste like burnt to me. It doesn't have that bitterness, but it's really good. This is actually yours. Don't let me take a bite of this. Here, pause for a second and grab yourself a. I love where it's sort of kissed on top by the oven. Really nice full bake on the bottom. Some people are gonna say that's too much color. It's really not. It really sort of balances out with the cheese. One of the other things I'd say here is that the sauce is fresh. It doesn't taste like a reduced sauce to me. It feels just like pressed tomatoes. So, okay, Frank Pepe's, very good pizza. Honor to be here, really. They should give you a ticket in New Haven if your car is more than a pizza box away from the curb. Take out and delivery. Do I go here? How much pizza can you eat right off the oven? Oh man, look at the bake on this, dude. Oh man. Oh, bottom's perfect too. Like not black, but kind of zebraed. And look how tomatoey this is. Wow. Wow. So thin, so evenly thin. Bake is really perfect, and it's just like crisp. If I felt any confidence, like in Pepe's, I just got crushed. Like all of my confidence to be able to make this just got crushed. The dough looks a little bit younger, although man, seeing those guys like throw it, it definitely looked, or it wasn't even a throw, you definitely couldn't throw it. It was definitely well relaxed. Wow, really tender. Like this one, more so than the others, just seems super tender to me, but very thin. You get about equal quantities of sauce and cheese and crust. Really, really nice, beautiful. Char is really nice. It just adds a really nice element to it. It's like, it brings this bitterness and sort of like darkness. A little bit of pecorino in there too. This has definitely got some fermentation on it though. Like this one smells more fermented to me than the others, which is interesting. It's also got a little bit more bubbling to it, which also says fermentation. Okay, all right. Wanna try some? So let's start with the dough. Now, if you go to Frank Pepe's, if you go to Modern, if you go to Sally's, if you go to Bar, if you go to any of the other great pizzerias down in New Haven, what you're gonna find generally is a very thin, extremely crisp dough, right? Part of that quality relates to these large brick ovens that they have, right? They do a very good job of making a very crisp dough. So I don't have that here, obviously, and that was one of the first things that I sort of tried to figure out was, how do I get a dough that is going to be crisp after the bake? I know down there they're using a dough which has a slightly higher hydration. For home, what I've done is I've taken their sort of hydration levels, the amount of water added to the flour, and I've dropped it a little bit. That's producing a crust which is crisp. Okay. The other thing here is that I'm using a high protein flour. I'm using bread flour, which is higher protein than all-purpose.
The reason for that is that I want a dough that will stretch extremely thinly without tearing, right? I need that extensibility, which I'm going to get through a long rise, and I need that base strength, which I'm going to get through this high protein flour. So let's jump in and let's get to this mix. All right, so water in the bowl, and now I'm going to add my yeast. So 0.3%, a very low quantity of yeast. So salt in the bowl and bread flour. It's a pretty firm dough. I know I've said that already, and the pizza people will say, that's not that firm. You know, pizza dough sometimes can be down in the 50s for hydration. This is 63, as I've mentioned, which for my bread hands feels firm. Feels like quite a firm dough compared to what I'm used to working with. Stir to combine. So I'm gonna scrape this down and get it out onto the counter. What I'm doing here is I'm just trying to get a little bit beyond this cottage cheese texture. What I mean by that is this sort of like lumpy texture. I'm just trying to smooth it out just a little bit. Something to remember with this dough is that after it gets divided, it's going to sit and relax and gain strength over the course of several days. This is so firm, I worry that it's not going to stretch. But it's how a lot of pizza is made, and I have run a test or two already, and in both cases it stretched well for me. So, you know, it's one of those junctures in the dough making process where I'm taking a little bit of a leap of faith, you know. Put a little olive oil in. It's going to go into a bowl for the first rise, a couple hours at room temperature. Put a little olive oil in, press it in there, turn it once, get a lid on it, make sure that it's covered. Put you away for a little while and we'll come back. Okay. So let's talk about this dough, which has now had a couple hours, and it's a stiff dough. You don't need a ton of flour on the bench. Just a little bit is gonna do it. Dump it out. I mean, it's puffed a little bit, but it's not a super puffy, gassy dough, especially for a dough that's had a couple hours, right? Now, we're going to make a pizza which is super thin and about 12 to 13 inches in diameter. For that size, what I found through some testing was that 200 grams was about right. I'm going to round it into a ball, and I'm going to do that just like we would shape a boule, and now it's ready for a long cold period in a container. Here I want a dough which is sort of larger in diameter with a flat edge crust. And so to support that, I use a container which is larger in diameter than I would use for a Neapolitan. But what's important is that it have a snap-on lid. Make sure that it has an airtight lid. Remember, these are going to be in the fridge for 24, 48, 72, maybe even 96 hours in the case of some of the ones that I've done. You need to make sure that it has an airtight lid. Not only for the cold period, but for the period after the cold period when it comes up to room temperature, tempering over the course of 3-4 hours or so. Okay, so find a good container, put a little bit of oil in it, just a little bit of oil in it to make sure that it releases. And then I usually go top side down, press it to make sure that it's well greased, and then I flip it once, boop, put the lid on, and straight into the fridge. Like I said, I do a minimum of 48 hours up to 96. It may even be able to go longer than 96, but that's it. Happy nappy. We'll see you in a little bit. I'll divide the rest of these. All of the sauces to me tasted very fresh. It didn't taste like a reduced sauce that had a lot of sugar in it or a lot of spices. Very simple, very bright, very fresh. And the reason I'm straining is that I don't want a super loose sauce, right? Remember that everything is kind of being done with the intention that we have a crispy crust. I'm trying to maintain that nice crisp crust. So I'm pulling off some of the moisture while still retaining all of that tomato flavor. I just put them back in the can, and I'll add a pinch of salt and a little bit of seasoning. If you want to just go with oregano, that's fine. And then I'm using my immersion blender. You could also use a food mill here. Great use for a food mill. So I'm just pulsing. I don't want a puree. I want some variable sort of structure to this. So I'm just doing it for a second. Let me show you where I am. That's the consistency that I want. It's not a puree, it's not like sauce, right? So I'm not using a ton of cheese here. This isn't a really heavily cheesed pizza. For the cheese type, I have got a whole milk, low moisture brick mozzarella. I like the way that it melts and I like the flavor a lot. If you use a part skim, it has less fat. So it might be slightly less greasy. It'll also be slightly less flavorful. You could also try a blend of half whole milk, half part skim if you want to sort of like divide and conquer there. Okay, so let's talk about this dough for just a second. Now, I started with a firm dough. Let's remember why. It's because I want the dough to be crisp. I also needed to develop a lot of strength so that I could stretch it very thinly. That's all great, but it introduces a problem of sorts in that that very tight dough needs time to come up to room temperature and begin to rise after the long cold period, right? And so in trying to figure it out, what I came to through some research, through our visit down to New Haven where I saw that the doughs that they had been out for several hours coming up to room temperature. So what I did was I took that technique. So after the cold period, I took them out, I left them at room temperature for several hours, up to 5 or 6 even, depending on your ambient conditions. And now we have a dough which is well risen, soft, and ready to be stretched. And then I just invert my container. Now, if you have been to some of the bigger places like Frank Pepe's, for example, down in New Haven, you'll see those guys literally just patting the dough on a heavy bed of flour, and it will almost do like 90% of the work just by sort of pressing it. Part of the reason that that works is because the dough is slightly higher hydration than this. The other reason that it works is that they're the experts. Those are the people who have shaped 1 million pizzas each or something like that, right? Our situation is a little bit different. We're trying to get up to speed on how best to sort of represent this style. So I'm going to use my rolling pin at some point, but I'm going to start with my hands. As always, there is a sticky side, there is a dry side. I'm being careful not to touch the sticky side, right? But I'm going to turn it once to make sure that I have flour on both sides. And I can feel already that the dough is beautifully relaxed. And I'm going to work the edges first. This is not a dough where I want a puffy edge crust. That's not the style here. I want very thinned pizza crust, edge to edge, right? So if I feel like it's starting to stick, I might invert it once. Continue pressing. And what I'm aiming for here is a shell which is about 13 inches in diameter, 12 to 13. I found that that's the sweet spot for this quantity of dough, and it tends to fit people's stones pretty well. So beautiful dough, nice and even and round. I don't see any thin spots. So one of the challenges that I sort of had to try and figure out with this was loading onto the stone. I don't want anything between the dough and the hot steel or stone that's going to prevent that level of char that I want, which is a classic element of the style of this New Haven style. So I'm not using the parchment here. You may find that you need to sort of practice this motion a little bit, right? There are elements of this which involve some learning, you know. So a little bit of semolina on here, you know, great ball bearings to help you slide. And you can see it's one of the advantages of this lower hydration is that the dough is pretty forgiving. I can pick it up in my hands, no big deal. You might want to just make sure that it's not stuck. Okay, not stuck. And did it shrink at all coming over? It's 12 inches exactly. It could be a little bit bigger, but it's okay. I'm not gonna be too uptight about that. Okay, here's my sauce. Still slightly chunky. Very much looking fresh and beautiful. And you know, as with all pizza making, make sure that you have your ingredients staged and ready, right? Do them in advance. I'm gonna grate a little bit of Pecorino Romano. Mozzarella is good, but it, you know, pound for pound, I think that Pecorino has a lot more flavor. And so we're kind of getting the best of both. We're getting the fat of the mozzarella and the coverage, and we're bringing in this sort of like pumpy, sort of beautiful hit from the Pecorino. A little bit of oregano, or if you have a spice blend, a little bit of that. Not too much. Squiggle of olive oil, just around. And we're ready to go. I'm gonna load this. It's gonna get 6 minutes at bake, and then I'm gonna switch it over to broil in just a second. Is it stuck? Nope, okay, we're good to go. So that's at 5.5 minutes. 5.5 minutes on the stone. I'm gonna move it up to an upper rung, and I'm just gonna switch it to broil for a short period of time to bring in a little bit more sort of char is the sort of nice word, carbonization, a little bit more of like a dark spotting to the dough. Okay, I think that's looking pretty good. All right, so when this comes out, super hot, right? Go ahead and put it onto a cooling rack. Just like a Detroit style or something like that, I've found that if you leave it on a surface, like if I take it out of the oven and then put it on my counter or something like that, or even just a cutting board, I found that it tends to soften a little bit more quickly. And what we're trying to do, again, is maintain that crispness. So I should have something that is really super crisp, almost crackery, right? So beautiful bottom color. That type of leoparding, that's what we're looking for. So I give it just a minute and then I'm gonna come back and cut it. Let me get my cutting board. Oh my gosh. That's what I want. If it's really crisp, it shouldn't have the flop. There's nothing wrong with the flop. If you like Neapolitan pizzas, and I love those too, you get more of the flop, but this is a no flop, no dip tip situation, right? You can tell that it's not a reduced tomato product. Just has that lighter shade to it. Crispy edge crust. It's so thin that there are no calories. It's almost like you could just snack on it all day long.